everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a pleasant spring night, almost spring night. No, it is. Spring's around the corner. My name is Scott Walter. I am Executive Director here at the Kickapoo Valley Reserve, and I can't tell you how excited I am to see tonight's talk. Before we get into that, though, I am going to read, and you'll hear this on into the future at events here at the Reserve, our newly minted land acknowledgement statement, just approved by our board. The Kickapoo Reserve Management Board acknowledges that the state and federal lands that comprise the reserve fall within the ancestral homelands of First Nations people, including the Ho-Chunk Nation. We recognize the sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk and other First Nations and will work towards a shared future by continuing to create collaborative opportunities to protect and preserve these lands. So tonight's presentation by Dr. David Drake is part of our Driftless Dialogue series here at the Reserve. Hands in the air if you've been to previous Driftless Dialogue talks. Fantastic. I see some familiar faces, a few new faces as well. This talk, I've got to mention the roots of this talk. It's supported by a grant from the Ralph E. Newsom Foundation at UW-Madison, and also by our very own friends of the Kickapoo Valley Reserve who helped put these things together, the refreshments, things like that. Without any further ado, though, I'm going to introduce a very dear friend of mine, Dr. David Drake. David, I'm going to pull this from memory, buddy, if I can, earned his bachelor's degree from a Minnesota college. I'm going to say McAllister College, is that right? Master's degree from Texas Tech, or Texas A&M, and PhD at North Carolina State in forestry, I believe, even though now he serves as a professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at UW-Madison and is Wisconsin's Extension Wildlife Specialist. David's been involved in the work he's going to talk about tonight for many years. The Urban Canid Project, learning a little bit about how fox, red fox, and coyotes interact with us in urban landscapes. So, David.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you. I know. Well, thank you so much. And Scott, I feel bad about not knowing as much about you as you do about me. It is a real pleasure to be down here. I enjoy Scott so much. He's one of my favorite human beings for many, many reasons, and I have not had the opportunity to see him since before COVID. So this has been a great opportunity to come down and see him and see him in his new role here as the executive director. This is one of my favorite parts of the state. It reminds me of a miniature version of the Shenandoah Valley out in Virginia. So I love this part of the state, and I haven't been down here probably for 3 or 4 years, unfortunately. So this is another great reason to come here, and I really appreciate being invited. So I'm going to talk about a project that we've had going on in Madison here since about 2014, when we first caught our first coyote. And we're going to talk about coyotes and red foxes in urban areas, specifically Madison, Wisconsin. So we have been studying coyotes, these animals here, and red foxes for a number of years now. And I want to give you just a little bit of a background on these animals and why they are found in urban areas. And then I'm going to give a bit of an unorthodox talk in the fact that I'm going to talk about some of our results first, and then some of our ongoing research. And then I'm going to end talking about some of the unique aspects of our research, simply because we're working in such an urban area. And I want to give you kind of a little glimpse about some of our methodology and the way that the community has embraced and supported our project, which is very, very meaningful to us and has made our project, I think, successful for that reason, amongst many others. All right, so starting off with these animals, both of these species are canids, so they're in the dog family. Coyotes are about a large adult male coyote, a really large one is about 40 pounds or so. Females are a little bit smaller. A really large adult male red fox is about 13 pounds. Females are maybe a pound or two smaller. Things like that. Both of these species are very adaptable, extremely opportunistic. and they are what we call generalist species. They are carnivores, so they eat other animals, but they really truly are omnivores in the sense that they eat berries and fruit and insects and vegetation and things like that. They're generalists in the fact that they can range across different types of land use and land covers, so they could be in agricultural areas. They're not a true interior forest species, but they certainly are on the edges of forested areas, shrubby areas, grasslands, and urban areas. And there's probably not a city in North America that does not have coyotes and fox, or there are very few cities in North America, I should say, that probably does not have coyotes and fox in the city or on the outskirts of the city. And one of the reasons these animals have moved into the city is because it's good living there. As I mentioned, they're very adaptable. Both of these species are territorial, so they will set up a territory and defend the territory as either a pack in terms of coyotes or as either a family in terms of red fox. And so they start exploring into these urban areas, and when they start colonizing or moving into urban areas, typically there are very few or no coyotes and red fox in there, so they don't have to compete with other animals of their same species for food and mates and den sites and things like that. So they move into these urban areas, and in urban areas there is a lot of food, there's a lot of den space in there, there's a lot of space generally in there, and for the most part it's a pretty good living. You don't get shot at. Typically you don't get trapped unless you're trapped by researchers, and you have a pretty good life in these urban areas. So that's why they've moved into these cities. And a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, the reason that we have animals in cities is because cities have moved out to where the animals are, and that is certainly true for some species. But for these two species, it probably is more true that these animals have moved into the city than the city has moved out to them. Okay? So that's kind of the general nature of these species and why they're in the cities, simply because there's a lot of food and other good resources for them. Okay, so I'm going to start off with some of our results, and I'm going to just kind of give you an overview of the results in just the interest of time. But if you want to ask some questions or have some discussions afterward, by all means, we're happy to talk about that. One of the very first objectives we started looking at with this project is we would live trap, and we still live trap these animals, and then put a radio collar on them. And then we follow them around based on where they go with the radio collar. One of our first objectives was simply to figure out where they're going in the urban landscape. And so there's quite a bit of knowledge known about urban coyotes, generated from primarily the Urban Coyote Project in Chicago, which is the longest running urban coyote project in the world. That was started in the year 2000, so it's been ongoing for about 22 years. There are other cities around the country that have variations of research or outreach projects of coyotes going on. So there's a decent amount of knowledge about urban coyotes. There's not so much knowledge about urban red fox in North America. If you go into Europe, people have documented red fox in cities like London as early as the 1930s. But in North America, we really don't know much about them. One of the things about coyotes and red fox is that they overlap in the types of habitats and areas that they use, and they do overlap in the types of diet that they use. So in non-urban areas, what is typically and commonly reported in the literature is that coyotes will exclusionarily compete for resources against red foxes, and because coyotes are about 3 times the size of a red fox, that they can outcompete red fox for resources. So typically in non-urban areas, what occurs is that where you have coyotes set up, you have very few, if no, red foxes, and if coyotes will catch a red fox, they will typically kill that animal to limit competition for resources. Sometimes they'll eat the animal if they're really hungry, but most of the time, as long as they're not starving, they'll just kill the animal and leave the animal be. So we wanted to find out, is that relationship, that competitive relationship, that antagonistic relationship that you see in non-urban areas, is it existing in urban areas? And so we followed animals around for 2 years, figured out that coyotes typically spend most of their time in urban green spaces like the UW Arboretum, Lakeshore Nature Reserve, so these natural areas, bigger blocks of habitat in natural areas in Madison, whereas the red fox are more closely associated with developed landscapes. So we find red fox in residential neighborhoods. We've had red fox trot up State Street, if you're familiar with that. We've had red fox on the Capitol Square. One of our radio-collared red foxes was photographed on the Motion W in the middle of Camp Randall Field on a Thursday when nobody was there. So that's where red fox are typically found. So as we're tracking these animals and kind of monitoring what's going on, there's a couple of things we're trying to key in on. Is one, spatial separation. So if you're a red fox and you're vulnerable to possibly being killed by a coyote, one way you can avoid being killed by a coyote is not being in the same space as coyotes. And so we found in our study area that there is spatial separation in some parts of our study area and there's spatial overlap in some other parts of our study area. So that really doesn't tell us much. It's kind of a muddled picture there. Another way as a red fox, if you are afraid of getting killed by a coyote, that you can avoid coyotes, is not being active at the same part of the 24-hour clock that your potential killer is active at. So we looked at the time schedule of where these animals were being active, and what we found is that red fox are active essentially the same periods of the 24-hour clock that coyotes are. So there's tremendous temporal or time overlap in that 24-hour clock. So we started thinking, well, we're not really sure what story to tell here because we have some spatial overlap, some spatial separation, a lot of temporal overlap. So sometimes that relationship that you might see in non-urban areas is carrying over in urban areas. Sometimes it's not. So that was kind of the muddled story we were going to tell until this picture came up. And we had a woman who called us or emailed us, excuse me. She lived in the Regent neighborhood, which is about maybe 3/4 of a mile south of the UW-Madison campus. So a very nice neighborhood. It's about where she lived. It's about a block from where the UW chancellor's house is. So we go over there, and she said, "I think I've got a fox den under my garage." And sure enough, she had an active fox den under her 2-car garage, where they had excavated an entrance under the back side of the garage and on the side of the garage. So we had a wildlife camera on the side entrance and we had a wildlife camera on the back entrance, expecting that we're just going to find pictures of fox coming and going and hopefully get really cute pictures of these fox kits that we can use in presentations and things like that. And we did get all of that. It was fabulous to see it and watch these kits evolve and grow and things like that. But one day we go over to change the batteries and pull the SD card, and we bring the SD card back to our office, and our jaws just about hit the floor. And here's what we saw. This is the dominant male fox here, and you can see the antenna. We had him radio collared. This is the antenna on his collar. This is a forsythia bush, and we're on the back side of the garage. This is all soil that fox excavated out from under the garage. And I was so nervous because there was so much excavation under the garage. I kept saying to the homeowner, you might not want to park your car on that side of the garage, because I was afraid that the garage floor was just going to collapse into the fox den. So here's the fox. This animal is one of our radio-collared coyotes that came over from Lakeshore Nature Preserve on the UW-Madison campus. And so we start looking through our SD card, and we're seeing this progression of pictures where these two animals are looking at each other like this. At one point, the coyote is sniffing inside the fox den. The fox is sniffing the coyote's rear end. Other times, they're looking at each other from about 10 feet away, and we're watching the timestamp, and for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, they're just staring at each other. That's all that's going on. So now we've got evidence that these animals can coexist in the same space and same time, which is a completely different relationship in urban areas, or at least in Madison, than is reported for non-urban areas. And coincidentally, as all this is going on, we had wildlife cameras on these two den entrances for the entire kit rearing season. And we also, just by dumb luck, had a film crew, a video crew with us, because we were providing some video to PBS Nature series, which made a documentary on urban foxes, and they used our study site and our study animals as part of their documentary. So for 2 weeks, we had a 4D camera, video camera, and what we found out between piecing the video together and all the still photographs is over about a 3.5-week period of time, this coyote kept coming back to the active fox den, and sometimes he would bring a mate of his from the Lakeshore Nature Preserve over, and they would come back about every other night. And what was happening is they were not coming over to harass the fox, to be aggressive toward the fox at all. They were coming over for a free meal. So the dominant male here and the helper fox were bringing back whole rabbits and squirrels and leaving them at the den entrance for the vixen fox and the kits to eat. The coyotes were coming over and grabbing a rabbit and eating the rabbit to fill their belly, and then they would go, and then they'd come back a couple nights later and do the same thing. And they did this repeatedly for about 3.5 weeks. Now, the fox are raising 3 kits at this den site, and there's the helper fox, the dominant male, and the dominant female, and then these 3 kits. And we know from previous years that there were at least 4 other den sites in this fox family's territory that they had moved the kits to from den site to den site periodically over 1 kit rearing season. So they clearly could have moved these kits from this den to another den anytime they wanted to, and they would have. They're not going to jeopardize the health and life of the kits if they felt that they were in jeopardy from predation. The fact that they never moved those kits told us that these animals don't feel that threatened by coyotes that they're going to take a diversive action and move the kits somewhere else. And the coyotes kept coming back repeatedly. The fox weren't happy. The male fox is just incessantly barking when the coyotes are there, but they're not doing anything to move the kits and move them out. So now we had definitive evidence that these animals can coexist in the same space and the same time, which is a pretty cool story to tell. And I'll talk a little bit more about why we think that is in a few slides. All right, so that was one of our first results, and we were very excited about that result and published that paper, and it was pretty cool to talk about that. The other thing I want to talk about, another result, is in addition to us radio collaring coyotes and fox and following them around, when we started this project, we were getting a lot of embracement, I don't know if that's a word, we were getting embraced by the public. And we were getting people, as they found out about our project, they would email us or call us and say, hey, I saw a coyote here, or I saw a fox there. And we wanted to gather all this information, but we weren't quite sure how to do it. And my graduate student and I were at a conference, and we saw somebody present on Inaturalist, which is a worldwide citizen science reporting portal, and you can create project-specific pages under the Inaturalist umbrella. So we created this page, and I'll talk more about this in a few minutes as well. But essentially, we had all this citizen science reported location data on where fox and coyotes were being seen in the city. Contrary to what you might think, it is not necessarily easy to catch these animals. And it costs a lot of money. It costs me about $50,000 a year to run this project. So it's not chump change to run this project, okay? The graduate students, they keep wanting to eat and live inside, and the radios are expensive and all sorts of things like that. So to the graduate student who was on the project at the time, I said, you know what we should do is figure out how good the public is at telling us where these animals are, and if they're really good at telling us where these animals are, maybe we can stop radio collaring these animals and maybe just mark them with ear tags or some other way that's not as expensive and is not as labor intensive. So we wanted to find that out. And so essentially what we did is over our study site, we just put an arbitrary grid on our study site of about 1 city block by 1 city block square. And then within each grid cell, we put a yes, 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 no, no, yes, or no, no. And what that meant is, yes, yes meant that a coyote or a fox was seen in that grid cell by a person, and we also had radiolocation data in that grid cell. Yes, no meant that a person saw the animal there, but we did not have radiolocation data in that grid cell. A no, yes meant the person did not see the animal, but we had radiolocation data, and no, no meant that nobody saw the animal in that grid cell. So we were primarily interested in the yes, yeses and the no, nos, because that's where all of our data lines up perfectly. Okay. So what we found out is for coyotes, about 56% of the time, the grid cells matched up. So we either had a yes, yes, or a no, no, which is not great. For red fox, it was about 65% of the time, which is still not great. So we need to do a better job of improving citizen science reporting. And what we found out is because coyotes, as I mentioned, they set up and spend a lot of their time in these urban green spaces, which has a lot of thick vegetation, like the Arboretum, for example, or think about Kickapoo Reserve here, if you're not familiar with Madison. So what's happening is we're having a lot of a person has not seen a coyote in these urban green spaces simply because coyotes blend in with the thick vegetation, and there are not as many people walking through those urban vegetated areas as in the developed landscape. So that's why we had more foxes matching up with our radiolocation and citizen science data than we did coyotes, because foxes are more associated with that developed landscape. So that was another thing we looked at, and we're still trying to figure out how to boost the citizen science reporting so that we can get more. If we're in the 90% area, then we'd feel a lot more comfortable about maybe not radio collaring these animals and just relying on the public. But we're not quite there yet, and we're not sure how to boost that factor. Okay, another thing we studied is looking at how healthy these animals are from a disease standpoint. So one of the things about urban wildlife, and it doesn't matter if they're coyotes or red fox or deer or turkeys or crows, it doesn't really matter what they are, but typically if you look at an urban species, an urban crow versus a rural crow, that urban crow is typically healthier from a nutritional standpoint because there's more food available to them and they don't have to move as much, exert as much energy to acquire that food, okay? So the more nutritionally healthy you are, the more immunologically healthy you are, the easier it is to fight off disease. So we wanted to look at that. And so when we first started catching coyotes and red fox, we drew blood and we would spin that blood down to get antibodies. And then we would also swab their nasal passage and swab their rectal passage with 2 separate cotton swabs. And essentially we had 2 disease points in time on every animal we sampled. So the antibodies gave us information on diseases these animals were exposed to at some point since they were born. The swabs, we ran PCR genetic tests on those, and that told us what viruses or diseases the animals were shedding at that particular moment when we swabbed them. Okay, so we had current disease information and historic disease information. So these were the diseases we kind of scanned for. Some of them you might be familiar with. So parvovirus, if you have a dog and you take the dog to the vet, they get vaccinated for parvo, vaccinated for distemper. Ehrlichiosis is a tick-borne disease similar to like Lyme disease. Leptospirosis is similar to a flu-like disease. So these are the things we scanned for, and everything in black, there was no statistical difference between coyotes and red fox. Okay, so they both had the same disease exposure or disease prevalence. There were no discernible patterns or trends in the data, anything like that. But what was really interesting to us was heartworm and Lyme disease, and these are in red, so if you're colorblind, I apologize, but heartworm is on top and Lyme disease on the bottom here. And what we found is about 1/3 of our coyotes had heartworm, and about 2/3 of our coyotes had Lyme disease. None of our red fox had heartworm, and only one of our red fox that we tested for had Lyme disease. So what we attributed this to is the fact that, and Lyme disease is a tick-borne disease, and heartworm is a mosquito-borne disease, okay? So keep in mind, we found that coyotes are concentrating a lot of their time in these urban green spaces. And in these urban green spaces, there's tall, shady vegetation, which is very good tick habitat. And there's a lot of standing water on the landscape, which is really good mosquito habitat. So we think that coyotes are more susceptible to heartworm and Lyme disease simply because they have longer exposure periods to ticks and mosquitoes because they're in habitat that is good for ticks and mosquitoes. Red fox, on the other hand, because they are associated in closer proximity to human beings in neighborhoods, business districts, and things like that, schoolyards. In those types of landscapes, typically we have mowed lawns, so we don't have tall, shady vegetation. The water runs off the landscape quickly into storm sewers, so we don't have standing water and puddles, things like that. So we don't have good mosquito or tick habitat. And generally, human beings don't like mosquitoes and ticks, so we spray for them, we get rid of them in some capacity, or whatever else we need to do to protect ourselves. And so we think that the red fox are getting a bit of a shield in terms of disease help by associating closer in proximity to human beings than coyotes. And so that was kind of an interesting finding. We have stopped drawing blood and swabbing the animals until this year. We started doing it again. As a side note, because we got contacted by the U.S. Geological Survey, the Wildlife Health Lab in Madison, and they are scanning for COVID in a wide range of wildlife species, and they asked if we would be willing to donate samples. So we've been drawing blood again and swabbing all of the animals we catch and giving it to the Wildlife Health Lab. And unfortunately, I don't have any results to report, but we're very curious to see if these animals have been exposed to COVID or not. And as you probably are aware, some of the deer populations in some of the Midwestern states, they have found COVID in the deer population. So it is possible. All right, the last result I want to talk about is this one, human-coyote encounters. So as I mentioned, there are quite a few cities in North America that have coyote populations in the cities. And people have a love-hate relationship with coyotes in the cities or in the country. It doesn't really matter. But in the cities, a lot of times, people, when they see a coyote, first thing they go is, they do a double take and like, did I really see a coyote? Is that a coyote? And then they realize it's a coyote, and then they're kind of excited, and then it quickly turns to, is that animal going to attack my dog? Is it going to hurt my kids? Are we at risk in some capacity? And so if you look at the literature, most of human coyote encounters that are reported in the literature are negative. And I should say literature, scientific literature, or media. And most of them are negative in nature, and it's reporting something that bad has happened between a coyote and a human being, or a coyote and a domestic dog, or something like that. And most of the accounts are either third person, they're survey driven, where somebody has been surveyed by mail or over the phone, or they're media accounts, and you know everything that's reported in the media is true and positive. So we had this awesome opportunity with our Inaturalist page, and by this time we had hundreds of people who were reporting coyotes and red fox to us. So we took 400 of those Inaturalist accounts where people have reported an encounter with a coyote, and we took 400 of those, and we wanted to look at these first-person encounters to see what does that encounter look like in Madison. And when somebody goes to our Inaturalist page, we ask them to report the species, the time, the date, the location where they saw the animal, and then we have 8 optional questions on there, such as estimate the distance between you and the animal. Between 0 and 5, with 0 being very calm and 5 being very aggressive, estimate the level of aggression of the animal you encountered. Did you have a dog with you? If the animal saw you, did it move away from you? Did it have a radio collar on it? Did it have ear tags? Things like that. Okay, so we wanted to take these first-person accounts and look and see what does an encounter with a coyote look like in Madison. And what we found, it was pretty interesting. So 97% of the human coyote encounters were benign. They were 97% of those 400 accounts we looked at. People reported the estimated aggression as either 0 or 1, okay? And a lot of times, people will over-report the aggression or overestimate the aggression. Especially if the animal shows teeth, then automatically it's a 10, right? If the animal starts walking towards you, it's a 20, and things like that. So the fact that people are saying 0 and 1, we think is actually very, very true, because people are not going to underestimate something like that. So, and I think the highest rating we had was, I think that we had 1 3, and I think we had 4 or 5 2s, and that was it. So most of it was 0 or 1. Most of the encounters of those 400 encounters we studied occurred during daylight hours and relatively close to roads. And both of these make sense, because in daylight hours, you have better visibility. You can see the animal. During nighttime, it's hard to see things because they blend in at night. It's dark, things of that nature. Close to roads also makes sense, because a lot of times if you're driving at night, and coyotes and red fox are active most of the time, they're active at night. If you're driving at night, the coyote runs in front of your car, you can see it in the wash of your headlights. So that makes sense why it'd be close to roads. The other thing with roads is, for drivers' safety, a lot of times they have vegetation management off the road, so you have really good sight lines for a long distance, and you can have a better chance of seeing an animal a long way away on a road or a sidewalk than you would in, for example, the Arboretum, where you might not be able to see more than 10 yards that way. So that made sense. And then most of the encounters occurred during coyote breeding season, which in our area is December to March. And that also made sense, because during the coyote breeding season, that's when these animals are most active. So that's when they're running the most. They're up and active, moving around. And the more you move around, obviously, the more chance you have to be seen. So all of that made sense. And then, like I said, we had about 400 accounts of human coyote encounters. And clearly, we don't have 400 coyotes in Madison. So the same coyote was being seen and reported by multiple people, very likely. So we thought that that was really an interesting story to tell about these animals as well. All right, so some ongoing research that I'd like to talk a little bit about is, as I mentioned with that first result, is we have been able to document that these animals can coexist in the same space and same time and coexist peacefully. is that the coyotes are not being aggressive toward the red fox. And we've caught that with our research, but we also had plenty of anecdotal reports emailed to us and shared with us in other ways where people have said, for example, I looked out my plate glass window at 10 o'clock at night, and under the street light I saw a coyote and a fox. They were walking down the street together. And we've had plenty of accounts like that. So we think that there really is something to the fact that these animals can get along in the urban area. And what we think is driving that coexistence is the fact that in urban areas, there's such an abundance of food. And so just in a city, think about how many rabbits you have and squirrels and mice and birds and other things like that. And so if you have an abundance of food that you can share, why exert energy unnecessarily to compete or exclude somebody from that abundant resource? So why do that? So what we're doing now is we are surveying different types of prey items that these animals might eat to understand the types and abundance of prey that they have available. We're also doing what's called an anthropogenic survey. So we're looking at the amount of human food that's available on the landscape, either directly or indirectly. So for example, if somebody is feeding their pets outside, that cat or dog food is also accessible and tasty for coyotes and red fox. Or if you have an unfenced compost bin, for example, that could be drawing fox in. Whether you put human food on there or not is providing habitat for small mammals, which is a prey item for these animals that would be drawing the predators in. So we're looking at both natural prey and human-provided food that these animals might eat, and then we're collecting scat, just a polite term for poop. And what we're looking at through the scat is what are these animals eating relative to what's available for them to eat. And so we're trying to understand their diet and really have evidence to suggest that the reason these animals can get along in the urban area is because there's just so much food for them to eat that they don't have to worry about outcompeting each other. Another thing that I think is really interesting is this idea about these animals crossing roads. And in urban areas, the number one mortality factor is getting hit by a vehicle. And so as these animals set up their territories or their home ranges across Madison, different home ranges have varying amounts of road densities. So some home ranges have more roads, and the road might be a 4-lane, 55-mile-an-hour road. It might be a 2-lane, 25-mile-an-hour road, whatever the case might be. But they have varying amounts of road densities and different types of roads in their home range and in their territories. So what we're asking here is how good are these animals at crossing roads? And the more roads you have to cross as a coyote or a red fox, does that make you more vulnerable to getting hit by a car, or does that make you more experienced and you're better at crossing roads? And the other thing we're trying to unravel is something to do with spatial memory. So for example, University Avenue is a 4-lane road in Madison. It's relatively busy. The speed limit is, I think, 35 on that road, but I know I don't drive 35, and many other people driving with me and passing me don't drive 35. So on University, for example, if a red fox gets across University Avenue successfully, the next time it wants to cross University Avenue, does it come back to that same point? Or does it go anywhere else along University Avenue where it is and just continues on its transect? Okay, so we're looking kind of at a spatial memory issue as well as how good are they at crossing roads. And we do have some known fate mortality where we know that this animal died by getting hit by a car, and we've got the spatial location of where that animal went, so we can kind of line up, well, this animal, eventually got hit by a car, but it crossed this many roads before it got killed, and so we can kind of figure some of that stuff out. All right. Everybody doing all right? Okay. I'm trying to wonder if you want to ask. Let me go on for a few more minutes, and then I'll leave like 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Does that sound acceptable instead of breaking it up and asking questions now and then going on? Okay. All right, so what I want to kind of shift into now is this idea about sharing with you a little bit about our methodology and some of the unique aspects of working in a very urban area. And it is fascinating, it is extremely rewarding, it's challenging at times, but most of the time I cannot believe they pay me to do this job, honestly. I'm really very lucky. And this is probably the most rewarding and interesting project I've ever worked on. Without a doubt. And it's partly because of the animals we're studying, but without a doubt it's because of all the people we encounter on this project and the way that the community has really kind of supported and embraced our project. So this is our study area here, which is essentially is West Madison, all of West Madison. So this is the south shore of Lake Mendota. This is Lake Monona. This is the isthmus, so the capital will be about right here. This is the belt line coming here. And then all these different colors just denote water, natural areas, different densities of roads, human development, buildings, things like that, okay? So the point of this is we are working in a very, very urban setting. Now, to catch these animals, there's two ways we could do it. We could either use a leg hold or a foothold trap, which would catch them right above the foot, okay? And it's a double set jaw trap, so it catches their leg between the jaw. Or we can catch them around the neck with a cable restraint trap. We only use cable restraints on our project for a number of reasons. So we trap typically between November and March. So most of the time, realistically, the soil is frozen. With that foothold trap, you have to dig that trap into the soil and bury it under the soil, okay? So in the wintertime, it's difficult to do that with frozen soil. The other thing with foothold traps is the animal has about that big of an area it has to hit in order for that trap to activate. With a cable restraint, we've got that big of an area for the animal to hit. So we have more surface area, so we improve our odds. The biggest reason we use cable restraints is we trap in areas where, we've trapped in areas of campus where I know like thousands of people walk within meters of our trap every single day, okay? We trap in areas where people walk their dogs, and we don't ever trap, obviously, in areas that without permission, and everywhere we trap, if people are walking their dogs, they're required to keep their dog on leash. Now, they don't always keep their dog on leash, but they're required to do that. When we have snow down, it makes it easier to trap because we can see where the animals go, and we can trap on these trails that they are moving on. When we don't have snow, we usually set out bait piles, and that includes setting out, we just drive roads and find a roadkill deer and throw it in the truck, and then we throw it out into a grassy or brushy area where we know coyotes are in the general area, we want to draw them into this bait pile. Watch as they start going through the brush, and when they start creating trails to and from the bait pile, we'll set a cable restraint on that trap, or on that trail. So these are, and we use deer for coyotes, we use beaver that we get from the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources for fox. Both of these species, when they decompose, start stinking. So the coyotes and the fox love them, but domestic dogs also love them. If your dog is off leash, your dog is going to track to that bait pile, even though your dog's not supposed to be off leash. The reason we use cable restraints is in case we catch a dog, which we have, to our knowledge, we have not done that in 8 years. In case we catch a dog, it is a lot less traumatic for the pet owner. The dog doesn't care, okay? The dog doesn't care if it gets caught by the leg or around the neck, because neither one of these traps hurt the animal. Dogs, coyotes, foxes, it doesn't matter which trap we use, they don't hurt the animal. It's a lot less traumatic for the pet owner to simply release a washer and slide that washer off the cable. It's very similar to a choke collar that you might use for your dog, than operating a double spring trap to get your dog's foot out of the trap. So we use the cable restraints for the pet owners, not for the pets, okay? And that's the reason we use it, because we are trapping in some really urban areas, and we don't want to catch non-target animals. But if we do, we want to make sure that it's easy to get that non-target animal out of our trap. Okay. So because we are in urban areas and we are on private property, we're on public property, we obviously need permission from a large number of entities in order to trap. And so for red fox, sometimes we are trapping in people's yards, in their yard, in a neighborhood. And not rogue trapping. I mean, we obviously ask permission, and they, all but one person in 8 years has said no. Everybody else has said yes. But we get permission from Madison Parks. We alert the Madison Police Department, hey, we're trapping in this area, so if somebody calls you, you know what's going on, here's our number, call us, and we can answer the complaint. We have to get permission from the UW, even though we're part of UW, we get permission from UW Police Department, UW Arboretum, Lakeshore Nature Preserve. We trap at the Research Park. We trap at neighborhoods. We have a DNR research permit. We also get the beavers from the DNR. So we have a lot of different people that we work with, and we are very happy to work with because it builds community support as really a very rewarding part of the project. All right, So some other things that we do that I think are unique to our project is we use it as a training opportunity for a lot of different types of students. And probably over the 8 years we've been doing this, I am not lying to you. I am guessing hundreds of undergraduate and graduate students have come out to learn how to set traps, check traps, learn how to catch animals, process animals, things like that. And we love having the students out with us. It is an awesome opportunity to kind of share knowledge and information about them. A lot of these students, especially wildlife students, are not interested in urban ecology. It's not on their radar screen, so it's a way for us to introduce a different aspect of ecology to them, which is really exciting for us. So that's been really fun. And then the other thing we do is we collaborate with the UW Vet School. And when we catch an animal, we have a list of vet students who are interested in wildlife vet medicine that are on that list, and we will call them, and they come out, and we provide them experience sedating, handling wild animals, obtaining health samples, blood work, swabs, things like that. So we give them experience, and a lot of times they're much more adept at hitting the vein to collect the blood in a much quicker time than we are. And so it helps us as well because we don't have to have the animal sedated for as long because we can get our samples quickly and then get the collar on the animal and then let the animal go. So that's been really fun to work with all these different students over the years, and it's just been a wonderful kind of a synergistic opportunity for us. The other thing that I am not lying to you about is we haven't done it since COVID, but prior to COVID, we have a Facebook page for our project, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but we would put a Facebook post up that says, we are about to start our trapping season. If you're interested as a member of the public to come out trapping with us, please sign up on this Google Calendar. And people could sign up and we'd ask them to put their name down and their cell phone number. And then we would tell them, here, if you're on this day, here's where we're going to meet you. And people would come out. And I bet you we've had 500 members of the public come out with us. And so we check traps every morning, 7 a.m. we're checking traps. No matter how cold it is, we're out there checking traps. We're legally obligated to do that if the trap's open, and we want to do it for the welfare of the animal, regardless of the legal obligation. But we had a woman who identified herself as 87 years old come out with us, and we've had kids, I would estimate as young as 3 or 4 come out with us. And it has been awesome because a lot of people, I'm gonna make an assumption kind of indicating towards you, but when I was talking about trapping, I saw a reaction from you that didn't look positive. And so we've had a lot of people come out who have not been positive about trapping, have not been all that interested in trapping, or maybe have some misinformation about trapping. And we talk to them about the trapping, and by the time they leave us, they may still not favor trapping, but they respect the tool in the toolkit. And that's really rewarding for us. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, most people like fox, most people are a little trepidatious about coyotes. And so when we have an animal, if we catch an animal, we put the people to work. So they take notes for us, we put gloves on them, they can go touch the animal when it's sedated and all of that kind of thing. And especially with the coyotes, if you are touching a coyote and you're up personal with a coyote, that changes your opinion of that animal forever. And that is a really interesting aspect for us, that we can personalize these animals and people have a different reaction to these animals the next time they see them. And when they talk to their friends and neighbors and family, they then share this information with them that we want to share with them. So that's been a really fun part of our project as well. We do a lot of outreach on this project. So I have an extension appointment, so we do a tremendous amount of outreach. Formal outreach, this is one of my prior graduate students. I think we were at the state fair here. We do a lot of community talks like this. Before COVID, we probably did 20 community talks a year on coyote and red fox projects. And one of the things we talk to people about is how to coexist with these animals. If you see an animal, what do you do? How do you keep your dogs safe? How do you prevent them from coming into your yard and spending time in your yard, things like that. We have a Facebook page. It's an open Facebook page, but we have about 3,500 people following us on our Facebook page. So it's a really great way to disseminate information to the urban public, and that in the urban realm, they're using social media. That's one of the ways that they get their information. So we're working with the social media. We worked with the Dane County and Madison Public Health Department a number of years ago to put together a 3.5-minute video that they posted on YouTube about how to haze a coyote. And one of the best ways to make sure you have positive coexistence with coyotes and other animals is to make sure that animal has a fear of humans in it, so that when it sees a human being, it moves away from that human being, okay? And when you do that, then those animals don't start being aggressive toward humans and pets and things like that. So this YouTube video has been viewed by about 55,000 people. Okay, so we do a lot of outreach on this project to increase people's awareness of these animals in urban areas, increase their knowledge and education, and increase their tolerance so that we can have a positive coexistence between coyotes and red fox and humans and domestic animals. Coyotes, also called coyotes, are a native species to Wisconsin and an important part of our environment, but we may not be used to seeing them in our backyards and neighborhoods. Their adaptability has allowed them to move into urban areas where they may be seen regularly. Seeing a coyote is not necessarily a bad thing, and in many cases you should enjoy watching the animal from a safe distance. However, on occasion, changes in coyote behavior may mean that a specific individual is getting used to human presence. If this is happening in your community, action is necessary to cause coyotes to fear humans. With a healthy fear of humans, coyotes and humans can coexist peacefully. To ensure that coyotes avoid people when they see us, you and everyone in your community needs to make them feel uncomfortable. There's a simple, safe way to do this. It's called hazing, but it only works if everyone in your community gets involved. It's important to know that the coyote is more afraid of you than you are of it. Face the coyote and stand your ground. Stand tall and raise your arms. In your loudest, firmest voice, yell at the coyote to go away.
Get out of here! Go! Go!
Use noisemakers like pennies in a soda can or a whistle.
Go! Go! Shoot!
Throw sticks, rocks, or other objects in the direction of the coyote, but do not throw food and do not throw any of these objects directly at the animal. Squirt the coyote with a hose. Using these methods should create fear of humans and coyotes, and they should leave the area. If they do not leave the area after repeated attempts to scare them away, please call Animal Services of Public Health Madison and Dane County. Here are some important safety tips while hazing a coyote. If children are present, keep them next to you. If your pet is small, say less than 20 pounds, pick it up and hold it in your arms. If your pet is larger than 20 pounds, keep it on a leash and next to you. And a very important note, do not haze a coyote if it is injured or sick. Also, do not haze a coyote if it is with pups or near a den with pups. Instead, you should leave the area. These methods work both for coyote encounters in your yard or while you are walking your pets on a leash. Hazing coyotes, however, only works if everyone does it and does it regularly. So please share this video and encourage everyone in your area to haze any coyote they see. Ongoing repeated hazing is one of the best ways to make sure that coyotes remain fearful of us, and this fear of us will result in a peaceful coexistence between coyotes, humans, and domestic animals. And the last thing I'll talk about is this Inaturalist page here. And so, as I mentioned, we wanted to capture all these locations where people were seeing coyotes and red fox. It helps us. We've published a couple papers out of our citizen science data. It helps us if we don't have animals in the area, for example, but people are reporting it. It helps us identify places we might want to go trap to get new animals on the air in different parts of the city where we don't currently have animals on the air. So you can see all these little pinpoints. These are all different areas where people have seen coyotes or red fox. And we've had this page since 2015. We have had 1,200 unique individuals. So they've registered as an Inaturalist user, 1,200 people, and they've reported upwards of 2,000 sightings of coyotes and red fox in the city of Madison. So this is extremely helpful to us. Again, as I mentioned, that human coyote encounter paper, that was all based off of our Inaturalist data set, okay? So this is really very helpful to us. And then the other issue is a lot of times when these people see these animals, they're excited and they want to share that with somebody. So we give them an opportunity to share it, but it also gives us an opportunity to hook them into our project, because now we feed this into our website, into our Facebook page, and so people now have some information at hand that they can utilize as they need to, okay? So that's been kind of a fun part of the project as well. And then I just want to acknowledge all the people that were on the title slide. They are all collaborators, co-authors, graduate students, members of the public. But we have just a tremendous amount of people that help us make this project go, and without it, we would be not nearly as effective as I think we are. So we really greatly appreciate the City of Madison for helping us so much. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, you've mentioned, kind of hinted at some of the characteristics of a coyote den. Could you tell us a little bit, you mentioned a helper and stuff, could you just give us a picture of a typical coyote den, and also if you could just put that over a year period?
Yeah, so December to March is typically when they breed, so that's when the dominant male and dominant... Oh yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. So the question was, thank you for that. The question is, could you give you kind of a year in the life of coyotes to some extent. So December to March is when they breed, so that's when the dominant male and dominant female will breed. April to June is typically when they are denning and they're raising the kits, and then July to November is the non-breeding period that year. And coyotes will typically den, again, in more natural areas. They will den underground or into a hillside where they either excavate an old groundhog burrow or they'll excavate their own den. My colleague Stan Garrett, who runs the Urban Canid Project in Chicago, though, they're finding them denning under parking decks, for example, in downtown Chicago. So, but they're typically underground, and you will use that den only during the pup rearing season. So other times of the year, they don't use the den, and typically the male doesn't go into the den, it's the female and the pups that are in the den. And then we're not sure what the pack size is, but we think it's probably 4 to 6 animals per pack in Madison, something like that. And typically you have the dominant male and dominant female that are the breeding pair, and then you have subordinate, typically females. The males get kicked out of the territory and have to go on to find their own breeding mate, but they get kicked out. But it's usually 1 or 2 subordinate females that help rear that next generation of pups. And then for fox, it's very similar. Fox are about a month earlier generally, so they go from November to about February, and then March to May or so is when they're rearing the kits. And usually we think there's about 2 to 3 members of a fox family, the dominant male, dominant female, and then usually a subordinate female that helps.
How long do the pups stay around?
Typically they will stick around till the fall, and then the males will start dispersing out of that natal territory. The females will stick around for a little bit longer period of time, again, if it's a subordinate female or not. But you have, so when they're born, that's when the population is at its highest, and then between then and into winter, the population starts dying off for a variety of reasons. Either they get killed by cars or disease, or something else eats them, or whatever the case might be. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about the benefits of having these animals around, both in the urban and in the rural landscape?
Yeah. So the benefits of having these animals around, both in the urban and rural landscape. So one thing, both of these species are native species of Wisconsin, so they belong in the landscape, and they have intrinsic value just for that. They are in the food chain, so they do a tremendous job of controlling prey items and prey animals like mice and rats and other things like that typically are prolific breeders, and without that regulation, those populations can explode. So they do a good job of kind of regulating prey bases. They can, not necessarily as adults, but as pups, they can serve as a food source for something higher up the food chain. As adults, when you get into wolf territory, so where you have wolves, which are much larger than coyotes, you don't see wolves and coyotes overlapping so much, because wolves will eat the coyote or kill the coyote, even the adult coyotes. So there's that. People just enjoy them from photographing them, from viewing them. There is a harvest of both of these species, so people harvest these animals for fur, primarily for fur. So there's an economic attribute to this, as well as putting up furs and the recreation of trapping and hunting and things like that as well.
Recreation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see where you're coming from. I'm not going to change your mind. I get that. But it is a recreational pursuit, and it's a legal and it's an ethical recreational pursuit. So, yeah.
What about when you take these populations out? do you then get a proliferation of what you don't want, such as rabbits, gophers, et cetera, So when you have these hunts, are you actually producing the things that you don't want?
Well, so I'm going to restrict my comments to urban areas because that's where I'm working. So we do not have lethal take of coyotes and red fox in urban areas, with the rare exception if a animal is expressing extreme aggression and for public safety, a animal or perhaps a couple of animals need to be removed from the population for public health and safety. But generally, there's not lethal trapping or lethal hunting of coyotes and red fox in the urban areas. So when we go out and do talk to people where pets have been depredated by coyotes, for example, and typically what we will tell people is we will arm them with information and facts. We will give them information about management practices that can put them in control of the situation, such as making sure you're not having food attractants in your property that are bringing these animals onto the property. Make sure you're vigilant with your pets when they're outside, things like that. But we do talk about if you can identify the aggressive individual, lethal removal of that aggressive individual would sometimes be warranted for public health and safety. So in that regard, but most of the time, we don't promote lethal management in urban areas simply because if you don't know which animal it is and you're lethally removing multiple animals, essentially what's going to happen is you open up a void and it's just going to fill back in quickly. So you're really defeating the purpose if you're not identifying that aggressive individual or those few aggressive individuals and try to target those animals. Yeah?
That Regent area den, did they reuse that den then?
Yeah, so they've used it a couple of years in a row, and then we don't think they used it, and then 2 years ago we caught a male fox at Hoyt Park, which is about 1.5 miles west of that den, and we were starting to track him, and he started showing up at that den, and we were surprised that and we don't think he wasn't part of the family from a couple of years ago. We're not sure how he found the den, but he found the den and started using it again, so yeah.
Could you go to that slide where the lakes are and people are reporting them, I think?
Oh, right here? Oops, right here. Oh, no, oops, right here. That one?
Okay, here's a story. I was ice boating, and there's Lake Mendota.
This is Lake Mendota here, and this is Lake Monona here.
Where's Monona?
Oh, this is Lake Monona right here.
Okay, there's a little park where the ice boaters went out, and so I was out there on the lake, and a fox went by on the lake.
Yeah.
How do you report a fox? He or she was
Yeah.
going from the west east.
Yep.
And the ice boater says, "Oh yeah, that's happening."
Yeah, so the question is, he was out ice boating in Lake Monona, and they saw a fox, so how do you report a fox in the middle of the ice? And you just kind of make up a sighting. Right, that's exactly right. And we do have, when the ice is on the lakes, we have coyotes from right around here. They will travel over to Maple Bluff, or they'll travel up to Governor Nelson State Park. So they will use the ice more as travel ways. Fox tend to spend their time more along the edges, not that they don't go across, but they spend their time around the edges. And what we think that this is probably more prevalent with fox than it was with coyotes, but in areas on the lakes where people ice fish, fox will go out to the ice fishing holes after people get done for the day, and they eat the bait fish people have dumped out of their bait bucket, and they also eat the entrails from the fish that people have caught. So they're using that ice as a food source. Yeah?
When you were checking for disease, did you check or find any mange?
So the question is, when we were checking for disease, did we find mange? We do see mange, or what we are assuming is mange. For mange, you actually have to scrape the skin, and we have not done that. But there's 3 types of mange. The one that is most common is sarcoptic mange that is caused by mites. And we have seen that. It seems to be not cyclical, but variable. Some years we see it, some years we don't see it. And it seems to be more prevalent in fox than it does in coyotes, although we've seen it in coyotes as well. So we do see it flare up here and there, and we're assuming it's mange, although we haven't scraped the skin.
We had a golden retriever that got mange, and the vet thought they got it from contact with a coyote.
Yeah. Yeah, yep, it could. So the question or the comment was they have a golden retriever that got mange, and the vet thought maybe that their golden retriever had contacted a coyote, which is possible. Absolutely, that would be possible. So it is. Mange is awful. It is absolutely awful, and I feel bad for these animals that have it because they it's not a very fun thing to have. That's for sure. Let me see if there's other questions. I'll come right back to you. Yeah. We were doing genetic testing on the swabs that we were taking, but we're not doing genetic testing on kinship relationships.
But you were able to identify that a fox who was unrelated went back to it?
Well, so let me say I assume that was the case. I don't know that for a fact. I should say that I assume that was the case because that den hadn't been used for a couple of years to my knowledge because the woman who lives in that house, she just sold the house this spring, but the woman who lived in the house, she was always in contact with us whenever they had somebody denning there. And she hadn't contacted us for a couple of years. And then I called her one morning and she goes, "You're calling about the fox, aren't you?" And so, sure enough. But I'm assuming that's what was going on, that it was not part of that family from a couple of years ago. Yeah. Let me come over here and I'll come back there and then here. Yeah.
I was wondering with the fox den and the coyote come into it, was that more of a coyote stealing the rabbit meal or the fox offering that as like...
No, the coyote was stealing the meal. So the question is, the coyotes coming into the fox den, were the fox kind of paying off like protection money, or were the coyotes just taking the meal? The coyotes, because that's the bigger animal, they can do whatever they want, and they were just taking the meal. And we had video where you could watch the coyote take a rabbit, go about 10 feet away, sit down, eat the rabbit, and you could hear them just chewing through the bones. Then they'd sniff around for a little bit, then they'd take off, and they'd come back a couple nights later. So that was what was going on. Yeah. And let's see, I think, yeah.
This study area is distinctly urban. For control purposes, you're relying on published data from non-urban areas. Have you considered establishing a non-urban control area?
Yeah, we are doing something like that, and it's not working out as well as we had hoped. But in western Dane County, which is where Madison is, and the next county over, which is Iowa County, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources was, for I think about a 5-year period, was conducting a deer study in that area. And part of the deer study, they were looking at predators on deer. So they were radio collaring coyotes and bobcats in that area. So we have the radio collar location data for bobcats in the rural area that we are looking at home range size, composition, things like that in those rural areas compared to our areas. So that's about as close as we're getting to that rural-urban comparison. Yeah?
Yeah, I raise beef over south of Viroqua, and there are some nights where there are packs of coyotes that will wake us up.
Sure.
Sound sleep.
Yeah.
And they don't seem to bother the cattle at all in calves, so I don't see them as an issue there.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, it seems like there's a real excessive population. Have you ever worked with the wolf people that, we continue to kill wolves?
Yeah.
When, as you point out, they're all an important part of the food chain.
Yeah, so no, I don't work with wolves, and there's a reason I don't work with wolves, because that is extremely controversial, and I don't want really anything to do with that. So coyotes are controversial enough for me. No, so, wolves are...
Would wolves help control the coyote population in areas where you have, obviously, an excess population?
They could, but then that opens up another can of worms, because where you have, for example, now wolves have been known to run down into this part of the state, but and there's no reason wolves couldn't live down in this part of the state, and historically they did live in this part of the state. But if you have wolves down here now and they're controlling the coyote population, wolves are also looking at your cattle as a pretty tasty meal, and now that's another conflict that's arising that's going to be even more controversial and political and contentious than just having coyotes around. So
I think deer would be an easier catch for the wolves than my cattle.
Sure. Yeah, but deer would be, but same with wolves is they're going to eat what they can find and what's available to them on the landscape. And so certainly they'll eat deer, but if cattle are available and they're vulnerable, they're not gonna hesitate to eat your cattle either. So.
How often does that happen? It's very, very small percentage, correct?
No, not necessarily. So the wolf population, I should actually have Scott talk about this because he used to be the big game biologist for the DNR. So do you want to share something with that about the population increase during the moratorium when they were under the Endangered Species Act?
Sure. So it depends on how you look at it. Certainly in terms of if you're a livestock farmer, overall mortality, due to disease, etc., wolf predation is a very minor component. But it does happen in Wisconsin. It happens multiple times every year. And if you're that producer who lives in an area where the wolf pack has begun to target your livestock, it is a big issue. And you become very vocal because your livelihood is undermined. So.
But the actual percentage is very low, isn't it?
Well, it is low relative to other things, but I think as Scott mentioned, if you're that individual, if you're trying to put your kids through college on the beef cattle, and all of a sudden, 2 or 3 of the beef cattle are getting killed by wolves that season, you take a different viewpoint of wolves all of a sudden.
Well, we see a whole lot of damage to crops by deer.
Sure.
By an excess population of deer.
Sure.
Because deer are not harvested nearly heavily enough.
Yep. Scott, I think you've got some more topics for the Driftless Dialogue series. Yes, sir. You've been very patient.
Real early in your presentation, you said, if I understood you right, 4D?
Yeah.
What is 4D?
So the question is, early in my presentation, I talked about a 4D video camera. That was what it was a Sony 4D video camera that apparently, I don't know if it's on the market now, and I'm not a tech guy, but apparently this video camera had been loaned from Sony to the filmmakers so they could use it in the documentary, and at that time, apparently, it was not available on the market. But I have no idea what it looks like. But that's what they told me. It's a 4D camera. I was like, oh, okay, it's a 4D camera. So apparently, it's a special camera that's very, very, it has very good images, resolution. Yeah, 4D, right, which is better than 3D, but not as good as 5D. So.
It's probably 4K.
4K is what it was? Okay, let's go 4K instead of 4D. Yes, sir.
So we are also often woken up at night by coyotes getting together and howling, and it's kind of wonderful. It's sometimes kind of frightening. It's interesting to hear them sort of calling back and forth between the hills. We think that often it's if an animal finds a deer or something and they're sort of calling friends in. Is that plausible?
Possibly.
And do they howl in Madison?
Oh, they howl in Madison. Absolutely, they howl in Madison. They howl for other coyotes. They howl with sirens, train whistles, dogs.
Or as a group? Or?
Both. Yeah, both. Very similar to what you'd see in the rural areas. Absolutely. And so they will howl for communication, just as kind of, so as a pack, they don't typically hunt as a pack. They hunt as singles or maybe doubles, but most of the time as singles. So they might howl, just say, hey, I'm over here, where are you? Or, yeah, I found a tasty morsel over here to share with the pack. So that's possible. They howl during breeding season, obviously. And Scott and I were talking beforehand that coyotes have this really cool thing called compensatory reproduction. So the more mortality they suffer, the more they breed to offset that mortality. And somebody has posited that possibly they howl, and when they don't hear other coyotes howling, it tells them, hey, the population is getting low, we need to breed more. Which I don't know if that's true or not, but it makes sense. It does make some sense. So, yeah, that's a good story, right?
Which has also been reported that they breed more, so when they're taken out of the population, then you get more coyotes. So actually, killing them is counterproductive because they will produce more.
Well, so yes and no. So there is some now information in the literature about compensatory reproduction, when it may or may not kick in. And again, sustainable harvest and a responsible harvest, that you can do that in a way that you can kind of regulate the population without kicking that compensatory reproduction into action. So I know I'm not going to convince you or change your mind, but there is a necessity for lethal management to regulate populations. And if you don't do it from a human standpoint, those animals are either going to get overpopulated and starve, or overpopulated and they're going to create a tremendous amount of economic and health damage, for other species as well as human beings possibly, and other ways, but some way that animal's dying, either at the hands of humans or at the hands of non-humans, but it's going to have to die, and whether that, however that animal dies, it's going to die. So it's just choose your poison, so to speak. Yeah?
Back to that region area den, do you know how big a block area or how big a range they went to?
So for coyotes, they're using about a 2.5 square mile area in our study area and about a 1.5 square mile area for red fox. Yeah, but we've had red fox that have traveled, well, we had a coyote, we caught a coyote at the UW Arboretum, and we had a recreational trapper catch that same coyote on his trap line in Rush Lake, which is 70 miles northeast of Madison. And we were catching, we had a little pilot study in Milwaukee where we were just ear tagging coyotes in Milwaukee. And we had a coyote that we caught in Milwaukee that got killed inside the fence at Chicago O'Hare. So that animal moved 83 miles straight distance south. We don't know how much it meandered because we didn't have a radio on it. So, and we've had our fox move, 5-6 miles that we're aware of and things like that. So they move around for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I mentioned beaver a couple times. How are the beaver doing?
How are the beaver doing?
Yeah.
It depends on where you are, but they're doing actually quite well. So there are a lot of beaver management practices going on in the northern part of the state because they are trying to protect trout streams, and so as beavers are cutting down the trees in those northern part of the states, they remove the shade, and the trout stream, the water gets too warm to house trout or hold trout anymore. So there's a lot of beaver management for that reason. In the southern part of the state, there's beaver management because they are flooding ag lands as they dam up streams or rivers. They're flooding roadways and things like that. But the beaver population is actually doing quite well in Wisconsin and in the United States. Yeah. Yes?
Early on, you mentioned that one of your big findings is that fox and coyotes can coexist. Was there other big findings, or was it just the fact that you found that one den that proved that, or were there other?
That was the primary evidence that we pointed at, that these animals can coexist. Oh yeah, so the question was, early on we suggested that these animals can coexist in the urban area, coyotes and red fox, and was that the one big finding, or was that the sole finding that provides evidence for that? So that is the primary point of evidence that we make that suggests that these animals can coexist. In addition to, as I mentioned, the anecdotal evidence we get from people, which we're getting enough information from different people and different situations where they're seeing that we think that, along with our evidence, we think that there's some truth to that. And then the other issue, in the 8 years we've been doing this, we have not been able to document coyote predation on red fox in our study area. And there's enough overlap in areas where these animals are within close proximity to each other that you would expect to see some predation over that time period if there was some aggression going on.
Okay, and then you did add to that they're, in an urban area there's more food, so they don't need to kill each other.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't. The coyotes don't need to expend energy to exclude or outcompete fox for that resource.
But that's what you went, one of the things you went to prove, and you did prove, you learned.
Well, we've been able to demonstrate that they can coexist. We are in the process now of trying to demonstrate that the food resource is abundant enough that that's what's allowing that coexistence. So we're not quite there yet, but that's what we're working toward.
Super. Thank you, David.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it.